It's time. It's time for us as a people to move on from monthly listeners as this end-all be-all stat. And that's in two different ways. One, stop using it to evaluate how your favorite artist's career is going, especially financially. And two, if you're an artist, stop using that alone to evaluate how your career is going. You know, my geriatric ass is old enough to remember having a CD player and bringing one to school. You ever seen one of these? In third grade, I would bring it with like a little pouch with all my dad's favorite CDs. CDs nuts, boy! When they start selling CD players in like 5 years at Urban Outfitters as this like alt kit accessory, I honestly might lose it all and like go move into the woods like the Unabomber. But even after CDs, I spent most of my music listener life so far using an iPod and uploading my favorite songs and carrying it around with me. I was probably the last person I knew to hold out with the iPod and not switch to streaming, probably because I'm like a pretentious loser. But when we as a people finally gave in and moved to streaming services as the normal way to listen to music, a whole new world of artist data opened up. Just on the fan side, if I go to someone like J. Cole's Spotify page, I can see his monthly listener number, I can see how many streams all of his songs have ever done, I can see his like worldwide streamer ranking when you're at that level, and I can see all the top Spotify playlists that he's featured on. And this is just from his artist page on Spotify. If I wanted to find more complex data, I could just look it up on Google and I'm sure some nerd has compiled it somewhere. Now, even beyond these fan-facing stats, J. Cole himself probably has insanely specific data inside of his own Spotify for artists, and he can use that to move accordingly in his career. In fact, anyone who has music out has that kind of data in their Spotify for artists account. Using my artist page as an example, I can see where people are streaming me, countries, and cities, even at a specific song-by-song level. I can see age, gender demographics, which playlists people are streaming me the most from, including some like really concerning and scary playlist names. Like, you guys know that like we can see those as the artists, right? Like, I really hope by now in 2023 you guys know that. That might actually be like the point, but yeah, we see them. And Spotify is even adding things like streams per listener ratio, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. And if I expand past Spotify, Apple Music shows me where people are Shazamming my songs in the world, which is honestly really sick. And what's really interesting to me is that while I'm sure musicians, or at least their labels in the past, had a ton of data to work with, I don't think fans back then cared at all, right? For the most part. In today's world, if you go online, you'll find fans arguing about their favorite artist's first week sales, their tour sizes and tickets sold, merch quantity moved. Anything that you can quantify, people are going to start arguing about it to say that their favorite artist is better than your favorite artist, and there's nothing you can do about it. When I was just popping in a Ramones CD as an 8-year-old, I never had one thought in the world about stuff like that. And I don't say this to try to imply that having more information is a bad thing. It's really the opposite, probably. But because this is relatively new, I don't know if we as a society really figured out how to process it properly. And this is something I spent a lot of time thinking about because I actually used to be a high school math teacher for 2 years. A big part of my job was to try to get kids to understand what data means and what data doesn't mean. So this is an issue close to home for me. Before I start tearing apart the monthly listeners statistic as a whole, we should define it as Spotify does. Spotify defines monthly listeners as unique users who stream your music at least once in a 28-day window. Your monthly listener stat changes a little bit every day because the users from 29 days ago that didn't stream you again are no longer counted. And your new unique users from yesterday and today are added into that pool. So every day, your monthly listener stat reflects how many individual accounts clicked on your song and streamed it. And they define a stream as listening for at least 30 seconds in the last 28 days. And now I'm going to give you 3 reasons why we should stop taking that monthly listener number as seriously as we do. But before I do, please like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Don't be one of my monthly watchers who checks in once and keeps it moving. I'm using this channel to talk about everything music that I feel like I have thoughts to share with you guys on, so come be a part of it and help me build this little world out. I appreciate you all so much for tuning in already on my first video. All right, so plug out of the way. Here's the first reason. Monthly listeners are inaccurate for artist size. The case study I have for this one is J. Cole and HADJI, 2 of the more popular rappers of our time right now. One of them, Cole, has been around for over a decade at this point. Well, HADJI has put in about 5 to 6 years in the limelight. And this is an interesting case because HADJI is actually signed to Cole's label Dreamville. So in those types of artist relationships traditionally, the artist who runs the label is bigger than the artist they're signing to the label. However, there was a time recently in the last year or so where HADJI had more monthly listeners than J. Cole. How is that possible? Is HADJI a bigger artist than J. Cole? Let's not immediately dismiss that. Let's look at the numbers. We can start with the classic one, album sales. Cole's last project, The Offseason, sold 282,000 album equivalent units in its first week, which makes him one of the highest selling rappers of his generation. It was certified platinum in the United States in 2021 within 6 months of its release. Now, JID's most recent album, The Forever Story, came in at just under 31,000 album equivalent units during the first week of its release in August 2022. Those are pretty awesome numbers, but they're also 9 times smaller than what J. Cole did. What about touring? Cole did an almost entirely sold-out tour for the offseason in 2021, doing arenas, and generally had between 10,000 and 15,000 tickets sold per show. JID, on the other hand, did a co-headlining tour with Smino, and did venues that were mostly in the low to mid thousands, like the 3,000 capacity Terminal 5 in New York, the 2,500 capacity Fillmore in Philadelphia, and the 1,800 capacity Van Buren in Phoenix. Again, those are amazing numbers for an artist to be pulling in on tour, especially in today's artist economy, when it's harder to get people outside for shows than ever. But clearly Cole is the bigger artist in this arena as well, no pun intended. Which is what makes the monthly listener stats so fascinating. How could JID have been in front of Cole in monthly listeners when we just established that Cole was selling way more units and doing way bigger shows? It's simple, actually. JID is a co-release on a single with Imagine Dragons. Imagine dragging these nuts across your face! Called Enemy, that was a part of the animated series Arcane League of Legends. The song peaked at number 5 on the Billboard charts and has over 1.25 billion streams on Spotify at this date. So how is that enough to get JID ahead of Cole? Cole himself has multiple songs with over 1 billion streams, including No Role Models, Wet Dreams, and Middle Child. Here's where the monthly listener stat can get really warped and wonky. Think about collaboration here for a sec. Let's compare Enemy with one of Cole's more popular songs, The London. The London is a collab with Young Thug and Travis Scott. Now, I wouldn't say that Cole is the exact same style or genre of artist as Thug and Travis, but I think the overlap in listenership is pretty solid. They're likely featured in similar Spotify playlists. For example, it's August 2023 right now, and I just opened up Rap Caviar, and all 3 of them are on there on different songs. However, the overlap between JID and Imagine Dragons is relatively much smaller. Imagine Dragons is like a future butt rock band. I don't really know what genre this is, man. I'm not even trying to clown on them. Like, I just don't know what I would call this. Arena rock, arena pop, arena something, I guess. I don't know. JID is a rapper who's played with genres like R&B and indie, but I don't think he's really entered like the stadium butt rock arena with the exception of this one song. So it's kind of a new thing for him. So the listenership overlap is relatively not that big, which means that for the Imagine Dragons listeners who are clicking on Enemy, there's a much higher chance that those are now new, unique listeners for JID, compared to a song like The London, or even Cole's new song with Lil Durk. Since those are collabs where the artists are already kind of in a similar genre, the odds that those songs' listeners haven't already heard a Cole song this month are a lot smaller. So that tweet about Cole and JID's monthly listenership is from January 2022. Let's take a look at their listenership now. Cole has 40 million and JID has 20 million. So yeah, it's not really that close anymore, because monthly listeners are extremely finicky if they're the only number that you're looking at. Here's a second reason why monthly listeners shouldn't be your end-all be-all stat. Not every listener is made equal. Think about the monthly listener stat for a second. To be considered an artist's monthly listener, you just have to stream their song once in the last 28 days. So if a friend sends me a song and I click on it and within 37 seconds, I'm like, I don't know, it's not really for me. For the next 28 days, I'm in that artist's listenership, even if I never listen to them again. Even if I block them on Spotify and I like go out of my way to just never interact with them again, for the next month, I am one of their monthly listeners. And I count just as much towards the monthly listener stat as that artist's super fan who streams multiple of their songs multiple times every day, goes to their shows, buys merch, interacts with them on social media, has a tattoo of them, stalks them, sits outside of their house, has a Stan account on Twitter, replying with fan cams of them, has like something in their Twitter bio that like says the date that they interacted with each other, has like a pinned tweet of like a picture of them at a concert. Like, I count just as much as that guy for 28 days. Spotify is aware of this, of course, and they're actually doing a much better job of educating artists about the difference between the types of listeners they're going to get in their career. Spotify for Artists shows the streams to listeners ratio now, which is basically like per every unique listener, how many times are they streaming that song? It's a great way to evaluate, one, if someone likes your song. I used to try to calculate this myself because I'm a nerd, but streams to listeners ratio or listeners to saves ratio are great ways to figure out if a song is resonating. If one listener is streaming it 5 times on average, then obviously they like the song. Or if like 20 to, higher than that percentage of somebody is saving the song after listening to it, that's also a good sign that these people are fans of you and they like that song at least. In the past year or so, they've been introducing segments to Spotify for Artists as well. There are 3 segments that Spotify considers in your listenership: programmed audience, active audience, and previously active audience. The programmed audience is people who have only streamed your music from programmed sources, like editorial playlists, Discover Weekly, radio, or autoplay. What? The active audience is defined as valuable listeners who have intentionally streamed your music in the last 28 days from active sources like your artist profile, album and release pages, and their own library and their own playlists. And the previously active audience is people who were once in that last group, but they haven't been a part of it for at least 28 days. Within the active audience, Spotify breaks it down even further into super listeners, moderate listeners, and light listeners, which is pretty straightforward just based on the amount these people are streaming you. This data is super thorough and interesting. And as an artist, obviously you want more of your listenership to be active ones rather than passive ones. And Spotify recognizes that, of course. And they've started giving us data like this to help artists see how many active, engaged listeners they truly have, rather than just monthly listeners. And a big reason why they've started giving us data like this is because monthly listeners is a super wonky stat to evaluate what kind of fan base you have. Just for me personally in my career, I've had as many as like 195,000 monthly listeners at one time. And right now I have about 60,000. But at the same time, my audience is more engaged than it's ever been. I do bigger crowds at my shows. I have more followers on all my social media accounts. And I sell more merch than I did at the time when I had 195,000 monthly listeners. How is that possible? Well, when I had my peak monthly listeners, I was on a big editorial playlist called Lorem. Now, almost everyone who streamed me from Lorem is in my programmed audience category for those 28 days. So they weren't actually active members of my fan base. Spotify didn't tell us who was in the programmed audience back then as concretely as they do now. Maybe some of them became active listeners, but the vast majority of them probably didn't, which is how these editorial playlists go for most artists. I'm going to do a whole video on editorial playlists in the next week or so, where I use my own data to show you guys what happens when your songs get on those playlists. But yeah, in short, not every listener is made the same. And for artists of all sizes, their monthly listener number is a lot higher than their actual fan count might be. Now for the third reason, monthly listeners only covers one DSP. Not everybody has Spotify. A study published in June 2023 shows that 37% of Americans said they use Spotify the most frequently. 21% said YouTube Music, 14% said Pandora, 11% said Apple Music, 7% said Amazon Music, blah, 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 whatever, etc. And on top of this, people use SoundCloud, Tidal, AudioMac, and a bunch of other platforms that I'm probably not even aware of. So if Spotify is less than half of the American listenership, then relying on monthly listeners to figure out how big your career is really narrow in scope. And that's only America. If we leave the United States here and we look at the whole globe, some countries don't even have Spotify at all. I distribute my music in South Korea to DSPs like Melon, Genie, and Bugs because South Korea didn't have Spotify until 2021. India didn't have Spotify until 2019. These are huge countries with tons of listeners. At the global scale, Spotify does hold the top market share at 30.5%. Apple Music is second at 13.7%. Tencent Music is at 13.4%. Amazon Music is at 13.3%. And YouTube Music is at 8.9%. Even though Spotify is obviously an industry leader, they are not the only platform that people are going to be listening to you on. So using monthly listeners and monthly listeners only to evaluate how your career is going or how your favorite artist's career is going is not going to be the most accurate picture. I've spent a lot of this video pooping on monthly listeners as a stat, and that's really not my goal at all. I think it's a really cool stat. And if we think about what the state of music was like when the stat was first created, it was really useful and effective in a lot of ways. I know some artists who used to buy streams on Spotify. Yeah, we knew. I didn't say anything, but we knew, bro. To make it look like they were doing really well when maybe they weren't yet. And I'm really not trying to make fun of them for it because, look, the game is the game, man. There's so many little schemes and tricks, and sometimes people get on playlists that they think are legit and they aren't, and, like, it's really not fair to, like, make fun of people for that. But, like, what made it so obvious back then, before people were as literate with, like, these stats, was that their monthly listeners would be at, like, 500, and then they'd have a song with, like, 200,000 streams. And it's like, unless these people are streaming your song hundreds of times and then telling nobody, just gatekeeping you so hard that they don't want anyone else to find out about you, it's like a really weird and unlikely situation, but I guess anything is possible. Then you probably just paid for a bunch of botted streams, and then the 28 days were up and you were back to square one. It was the Wild West back then, so monthly listeners were a great stat to point out some of the fakers. And it can still be a good kind of like rudimentary stat to figure out how you're doing in promoting your music. For example, if you have 500 monthly listeners and you just started promoting a song on TikTok or Instagram and it drops and you see your listeners jump to 2,000, then you know you might have gotten quite a few conversions from these posts. Something is working and you don't have to get immediately data nerdy about why it's working or how it's working. You can just look right at the front page of your artist profile and be like, cool, this is a good start. But if you're an artist, do not let your current monthly listener count dictate how you feel about your career. You shouldn't let any number do that, but you definitely shouldn't let one as hollow and finicky as monthly listeners be the one that decides how your day is going to go today. If you're worried that labels won't pay attention to you if you're like under a certain number or something, that's really not how it works in most cases. Labels, especially major labels, just want to find someone that they think is marketable. And they can even see that when you have 10 monthly listeners. I mean, look at Pinky Doll. They could even see that before you put out music at all sometimes. And don't judge others on their current monthly listener level. Don't be that guy. If you find someone dope that has like 10 monthly listeners, don't let that stop you from working with them. That's stupid. And on the contrary, if you find someone whose music is like straight ass and they're reaching out to you to work and you don't want to, don't do it. It's probably not going to do much for you in the long run. Don't be a little clout goblin. You're better than that. I see you. Don't do it. And if you're not an artist, but you have a parasocial relationship with your favorite artist, and you want to argue with your friends at the lunch table or the party, where you're all too scared to talk to whoever you're attracted to, so you're in the back just arguing about rappers or something, don't let monthly listeners be the stat you use in the argument, because you're probably going to get skewered like a souvlaki by someone who actually knows what they're talking about. It's not a super accurate way to judge the size of an artist. And it's definitely not a good way to figure out how much money they're making if you're into pocket watching like that. I don't recommend doing it with monthly listeners. So yeah, again, I don't think the monthly listener stat is a bad thing. It's just a number at the end of the day. Men lie, women lie, numbers don't. But numbers can also be kind of misleading. The way that we as a people, either as artists ourselves or as fans of other artists, grapple with that number is the problem that I'm really trying to address here. So let's free ourselves from the grasp of monthly listeners. And let's just do better, you know? Peace.